There are stories in the Bible that almost no one is ever taught. Not because they're boring, not because they're irrelevant, but because they're dangerous. Stories that contradict the version you grew up with. Stories that question authority, obedience, and fear. Stories that don't make God look distant, but uncomfortable. And once you hear them, you can't unhear them. Tonight, we're opening the pages that sermons skip, not to destroy faith, but to expose what was quietly buried. Because what if the Bible you were taught was only the safest version? And what happens when the unsafe stories come back to life? The God who loses arguments. We are taught from the beginning that God is all-knowing, all-powerful, always right, a perfect authority that does not bend, does not hesitate, does not reconsider. That idea becomes the foundation of obedience. If God cannot be questioned, then neither can the systems that claim to speak for him. But buried inside the text is a contradiction that almost no one lingers on. There are moments where humans do not simply pray or submit. They argue, they push back, they reason, and somehow, impossibly, they succeed. Abraham stands before God as entire cities are marked for destruction. He does not beg, he negotiates. What if there are 50 righteous people? What if there are 40, 30, 20, 10? Each time, God agrees. The number drops, the destruction pauses. The fate of thousands shifts because one human dares to challenge divine certainty. That is not blind obedience. That is moral confrontation. Then there is Moses. After the golden calf, divine anger erupts. God speaks of wiping the people out and starting over, and Moses refuses to accept it. He reminds God of promises already made. He appeals to reputation, to legacy, to justice. And the text says something astonishing. God relents. The plan changes. Pause there. Let that land. If God is unchanging, why does reasoning matter? If divine will is fixed, why does persuasion work at all? These are not small details. They are seismic cracks in the story of absolute authority. These moments are rarely emphasized because they introduce a dangerous idea. That questioning power is not rebellion, it is participation. That moral responsibility does not end at obedience, it begins there. In these stories, faith is not silence, it is engagement. The human is not a servant awaiting commands. The human is a moral agent expected to speak when something feels wrong, even when the voice on the other side is divine. Once you notice this pattern, everything shifts. God is no longer a distant ruler demanding submission. God becomes a presence willing to be challenged. And authority becomes something that must withstand reason, not suppress it. That realization shakes the entire structure. Because if Abraham could question God and Moses could argue with him, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who told you that you were not allowed to question at all? And that is only the beginning. Because the next buried story suggests something even more unsettling, that obedience was never the highest virtue to begin with. The time God regretted creation. There is a sentence in the Bible that almost never survives the pulpit. It is short, quiet, and devastating in its implications. And God regretted that he had made mankind. One word does all the damage. Regret. Regret is not perfection. It is not certainty. It is not the language of an unchanging, flawless plan. Regret implies reflection. It implies looking back and wondering whether something should have unfolded differently. That alone should make us pause. Before the flood, the text does not describe God as cold or calculating. It describes sorrow, a grief so deep that creation itself feels like a mistake. Not rage, not moral superiority, sorrow. The kind that comes from unmet expectations and unintended consequences. This version of God does not resemble the distant, untouchable authority figure often presented in sermons. This is a creator staring at his own work and feeling pain, wrestling with what has gone wrong, confronting the limits of control. It feels disturbingly human. And that is exactly why this verse is rarely explored. Because regret makes God relatable, and a relatable God is harder to fear. Fear requires distance. It requires perfection. It requires the idea that power never hesitates and never doubts. Once doubt enters the story, fear begins to weaken. Historically, fear has always been useful. Fear keeps people compliant. Fear discourages questions. Fear makes obedience feel like survival. A God who regrets complicates all of that. A God who feels sorrow invites empathy instead of submission. But the text does not stop there. The regret before the flood is not framed as a final judgment on humanity. It is framed as a response to violence, corruption, and imbalance. As if the problem is not that humans existed, but that something went deeply wrong in how they lived. And that raises a quiet, unsettling possibility. What if the story is not about humanity failing God, but about God grappling with the reality of free beings who cannot be perfectly controlled? What if regret is the cost of creating something capable of choice? This reframes the entire relationship. Creation is no longer a finished product. It is an experiment, a risk, a process that can disappoint even its creator. That idea is rarely preached because it shifts responsibility. It suggests humans were not designed to remain small, predictable, or easily managed. And if regret exists at the heart of creation, then growth, conflict, and transformation were never accidents. They were always part of the price. And that leads to an even more dangerous thought. What if the story of humanity was never meant to be neat or obedient at all? The forbidden knowledge that made us human. The Garden of Eden is almost always taught as a simple morality lesson. Disobey God, eat the fruit, get punished, end of story. It becomes a warning about rules, obedience, and consequences, repeated so often that no one slows down to actually read what happens. But when you read it carefully, something feels off. The serpent makes a promise. Your eyes will be opened. That is not deception. That is exactly what occurs. Adam and Eve do not drop dead. They do not collapse in divine fury. They become aware. They recognize themselves. They understand difference, good and evil, nakedness, choice. The punishment is not death in the moment. It is consciousness. That detail changes everything. If the act was purely sinful, why does it result in understanding rather than corruption? Why does the story describe awakening instead of decay? What they gain is not power over God. It is power over themselves. Selfhood is born in that moment. So is moral responsibility. Before the fruit, there is innocence, but also dependence. After the fruit, there is fear, shame, and complexity, but also autonomy. They are no longer children in a protected garden. They are beings who must now choose how to live. That raises an uncomfortable question. What if the true danger was never disobedience? What if it was independence? A human capable of judging, questioning, and choosing no longer needs constant supervision. And that is far more threatening to control than simple rule breaking. This interpretation is rarely explored because it reframes the fall entirely. The story stops being about moral failure and becomes a story about maturation, about leaving safety, about the painful cost of becoming aware. Every parent knows this moment. The day a child stops trusting blindly, the day questions begin, the day innocence gives way to understanding. Growth always feels like loss at first. Once knowledge becomes sacred, control becomes fragile. Because you cannot unteach awareness, you cannot return to the garden once you know who you are. And this idea does not remain isolated in Eden. It echoes forward. It mutates. It becomes more dangerous. Because later, stories will punish not just the desire to know, but the act of teaching knowledge itself. And when knowledge becomes a crime, something darker is already unfolding. The books that were never allowed in. There are texts that were written beside the Bible, not centuries later, but alongside it. Stories read by early believers, quoted by prophets, referenced indirectly in Scripture itself. And yet, they never made it inside the final collection. These writings tell a very different kind of story. They speak of angels who rebel, not out of pride, but out of curiosity and desire. They describe humans who ascend, who learn, who cross boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. Heaven is not presented as a place of perfect harmony, but as a realm of tension, hierarchy, and internal conflict. The most famous of these texts is the Book of Enoch. In it, angels descend to earth and teach humanity forbidden knowledge, science, astronomy, language, medicine, the mechanics of the world itself. And for this act, they are condemned, not because they destroy humanity, but because they elevate it. Pause and ask yourself why. Why is teaching humans considered corruption? Why is knowledge framed as contamination rather than growth? Why is curiosity treated as rebellion? These texts were not erased by accident. They were debated, filtered, and ultimately excluded, because they suggested something deeply unsettling to authority. That humans were capable of understanding the structure of reality. That divine knowledge was not meant to remain locked away. That obedience was not the highest purpose of creation. Once those ideas were removed, faith became easier to manage. Simpler, cleaner, safer, a system of rules rather than a journey of discovery, belief instead of exploration. But something was lost in the process. Faith became smaller, less daring, less dangerous. Because a faith that encourages knowledge cannot rely on fear, and a faith that cannot rely on fear must stand on truth alone. The shrinking did not stop with books. Once the stories were narrowed, the people were next. Thinkers became heretics. Questioners became threats. Curiosity itself became suspicious. When knowledge is removed from the sacred story, it does not disappear. It goes underground. And underground ideas have a way of resurfacing with force. Because when you tell humanity it was never meant to know, the desire to understand only grows stronger. And that tension did not end with ancient texts. It followed people, women whose voices were quietly removed. There are women in the Bible who do not sit quietly in the background. They lead armies. They deliver divine judgment. They teach men. They speak with authority and are listened to. Prophets, judges, strategists, truth-tellers. At the beginning, their presence is undeniable. But as time passes, something strange happens. Their roles begin to shrink. Their stories become shorter. Their authority is softened, reinterpreted, or explained away. Not because the original text demands it, but because later systems do. Institutions have always been uneasy with women who speak divine truth. A woman who claims moral authority does not fit neatly into hierarchies built on control. She cannot be easily managed. She disrupts the chain of command. So, the story changes. A leader becomes a helper. A prophet becomes a symbol. A teacher becomes an exception. Over time, the voice fades. What was once direct becomes metaphorical. What was once central becomes optional. And eventually, it becomes forgotten. This process is quiet. It does not look like erasure. It looks like interpretation, like tradition, like order. But the effect is the same. When women are removed from positions of authority in sacred stories, faith loses dimension. It becomes narrower, less complex, less human, because half of human experience is no longer allowed to speak fully. Truth needs contrast to be complete. It needs multiple perspectives. When one voice dominates, certainty replaces wisdom. What remains is a version of faith that feels oddly hollow, structured, predictable, safe, but missing something essential. This is not about modern values imposed on ancient texts. It is about recognizing what was already there and asking why it was slowly pushed aside. Why voices that once spoke boldly now whisper, if they are heard at all. And once you notice this pattern, you see it everywhere. Not just in scripture, but in how authority protects itself. Power rarely announces what it removes. It simply stops repeating it. But here is the deeper tension. Some of the most radical stories in the Bible do not revolve around obedience, hierarchy, or even salvation as it is later defined. They revolve around transformation, healing, liberation, inner change. And when those stories are read carefully, another unsettling idea emerges. What if salvation was never meant to be the ultimate goal? What if something else mattered more? The Jesus who didn't preach religion. Jesus almost never speaks the way religious systems expect him to. He does not spend his time outlining belief structures or demanding intellectual agreement. He does not offer a checklist of doctrines that guarantee safety. Instead, he talks about behavior, about compassion, shown in public and in private, about hypocrisy hidden behind titles, about power used to dominate instead of serve. When he confronts people, it is rarely the obvious sinners. It is the religious leaders, the experts, the ones who claim moral authority. He calls them blind guides, whitewashed tombs. He exposes their obsession with rules while ignoring suffering right in front of them. And he does not follow the rules himself. He heals on forbidden days. He eats with the wrong people. He touches what is considered unclean. He speaks in riddles that confuse crowds instead of reassuring them. He refuses to make things simple. When someone finally asks the most important question, how to inherit eternal life, the answer is shockingly unsatisfying to anyone expecting a creed. Jesus does not say, believe harder. He does not say, join the right group. He says, sell what you have and care for others. Let go of attachment, act differently, live differently. That response shifts the entire focus. Salvation becomes less about future reward and more about present transformation, less about affiliation and more about action. This version of Jesus is deeply uncomfortable because it cannot be controlled by doctrine. You cannot outsource it to belief alone. It demands internal change that shows up externally. It requires honesty, sacrifice, and responsibility. And that version of Jesus rarely survives institutional storytelling. Institutions depend on clarity, boundaries, and certainty. They grow by defining who is inside and who is out. Inner transformation is unpredictable. It cannot be measured easily. It does not scale well. So, the story simplifies. Teach the beliefs, repeat the formulas, emphasize loyalty over change. Over time, Jesus becomes a symbol of the system rather than its greatest critic. But when you read the stories closely, he is constantly dismantling certainty. He leaves people confused, challenged, unsettled. He offers no comfort to those who hide behind rules. He offers no easy assurance to those who refuse to change. Certainty feels safe, but safety was never the point. And once that realization sinks in, a final question emerges. Why were so many of these unsettling truths pushed to the margins? The answer reveals more about power than about faith itself. Why these stories were buried. These stories were not hidden because they weakened faith. They were hidden because they strengthened thinking. They forced the reader to slow down, to wrestle with contradiction, to carry moral responsibility instead of handing it away. They invite questions that cannot be easily controlled. They ask not only what is commanded, but why. They refuse to let obedience be the final virtue. And that is dangerous to any system built on certainty and fear. A believer who thinks is unpredictable. A believer who questions cannot be managed through simple rules. Fear works best when answers are prepackaged and doubt is framed as failure. Thinking disrupts that balance. So over time, the sharp edges were softened. The uncomfortable contradictions were smoothed over. The stories that raised difficult questions were pushed into the background or explained away. Not erased outright, but domesticated. Safe enough to repeat, harmless enough to ignore. What remained was a version of faith designed to be inherited rather than explored. Something passed down like a fixed object instead of discovered like a living process. A faith that values repetition over insight, loyalty over responsibility, comfort over truth. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, through tradition, through emphasis, through silence. People were not told what to stop thinking. They were simply told what to focus on. And focus is a powerful form of control. When only certain stories are repeated, they begin to feel like the whole picture. When questions are never modeled, curiosity begins to feel unsafe. Over time, people learn not to ask, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer feel necessary. But buried stories have a way of resurfacing. Contradictions do not disappear just because they are ignored. They wait. They linger. They return when people begin to sense that something does not quite fit. And that moment is where real faith either deepens or collapses. Because faith that cannot survive questioning was never strong. It was protected. The stories were buried to preserve certainty, but certainty is fragile. And once the buried questions rise again, comfort is no longer enough. The Bible is not shallow, but the version most people are given often is, not because truth is missing, but because truth is heavy. It demands effort. It asks you to think, to wrestle, to stand inside uncertainty without rushing for comfort. The buried stories do not destroy belief. They restore its depth. They remind us that faith was never meant to be passive consumption, and truth was never meant to be convenient or easy to digest. Real faith stretches you. It changes how you see power, responsibility, and yourself. Maybe the real danger was never that people would lose God. Maybe it was that they would stop outsourcing their conscience, that they would find their own voice and realize they are accountable for how they live, not just what they believe. So keep questioning, keep reading between the lines. Let curiosity do its work. And if you value truth over comfort, stay curious and subscribe.